This segment is on the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest area of the brain and contains motor, sensory, and association areas. Conscious thoughts and all intellectual functions originate in the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebrum is involved in the processing of somatic, sensory, and motor information. Gray matter in the cerebrum is located in the cerebral cortex. The white matter of the cerebrum lies deep to the cerebral cortex. A layer of cerebral cortex covers the paired cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral cortex layer is anywhere from 1 to 4.5 millimeters thick. The gyri increase the surface area of the cerebral hemispheres. Over the course of human evolution, the cerebral hemispheres have enlarged at a much faster rate than the rest of the brain. The two cerebral hemispheres are separated by a deep longitudinal fissure. The interior of the cerebrum consists mostly of white matter. The cerebral hemispheres are connected by a deep, thick tract of white matter called the corpus callosum. This structure bridges the two hemispheres at the base of the longitudinal fissure and is easily identified as the curved white structure at the base of the cerebrum. The corpus callosum alone contains more than 200 million axons. Each cerebral hemisphere can be divided into lobes named after the overlying bones of the skull. On each hemisphere, the central sulcus, a deep groove, divides the anterior frontal lobe from the more posterior parietal lobe. The lateral sulcus is a horizontal groove that separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. The parieto-occipital sulcus is a groove that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Each cerebral hemisphere receives sensory information from the opposite side of the body. Each cerebral hemisphere also sends motor commands to the opposite side of the body. For example, the motor areas of the left cerebral hemisphere control muscles on the right side. The two hemispheres have different functions, even though they look almost identical. We will discuss these different functions in a bit. The boundaries of the cerebral cortex are indistinct and have some overlap, so one region may have several functions. Normal individuals use all portions of the brain. The central sulcus of the cerebral cortex separates the motor and sensory areas of the cortex. Immediately anterior to the central sulcus is the precentral gyrus. This gyrus contains the primary motor cortex, where voluntary commands to skeletal muscles are generated. The postcentral gyrus is on the parietal lobe and contains the primary sensory cortex, where the general sense of touch is perceived. Sensations such as touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, or temperature are perceived here. The other four senses, sight, hearing, smell, and taste, involve the processing of complex information, and so there are specific cerebral cortex areas devoted to processing these messages. These specific areas are larger than the postcentral gyrus for touch. The occipital lobe contains the visual cortex, where visual impulses from the eyes are interpreted. The frontal lobe contains the gustatory cortex, where the sensation of taste is processed. The temporal lobe contains the auditory cortex, where the sense of hearing is processed, and the olfactory cortex, where the sense of smell is processed. Association areas are regions that either interpret the sensory information from the sensory cortex, or they coordinate motor commands into an appropriate response. In other words, the sensory association areas monitor and interpret information arriving at the sensory cortex, and the motor association areas coordinate a motor response. The premotor cortex contains the somatic motor association area found in the frontal lobe. The somatic motor association area is responsible for the coordination of learned movements and will relay that information to the primary motor cortex for the performance of movement. The somatic sensory association monitors activity in the primary sensory cortex. For example, information regarding light touch will be sent to the primary sensory cortex, but it is the somatic sensory association area that will identify that light touch as actually a fly on your arm. For another example, if you see the letters C, A, and T, this is processed in the visual cortex. The visual association area allows you to interpret these letters to mean cat. The temporal lobe contains the auditory cortex and the olfactory cortex. The integrative centers are areas that receive information from other association areas and direct complex motor activities. The general interpretive area, or Wernicke's area, receives information from all sensory association areas. This center is only found in the left hemisphere. It plays an important role in coordinating access to complex visual and auditory memories. Damage to the general interpretive area affects the ability to interpret what is seen or heard, even though the words are understood as individual entities. For instance, the instructions to sit there cannot be followed because the words sit and there are understood but not together. The person with damage to this area would not be able to follow such a command. The speech center or Brokaw's area regulates the patterns of breathing and vocalization. This center is also only found in the left hemisphere. A person with a damaged speech center can make sounds but not words. A person with damage to this area, such as with a stroke, will be able to utter the sounds but not be able to vocalize words. The prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe coordinates information from association areas of the entire cortex. The prefrontal cortex will perform abstract intellectual functions such as the prediction of consequences of actions. We know that a toddler does not have this area well formed yet because they are not yet able to predict consequences of actions, such as touching a hot stove. Anxiety, tension, and frustration are generated at the prefrontal cortex as it interprets ongoing events and makes predictions about consequences. A prefrontal lobotomy is the surgical removal of parts of the prefrontal cortex and other regions to alleviate anxiety, tension, and frustration, and prevent actions that would cause severe consequences. This procedure may be performed on a patient with extreme anxiety or on a prisoner with a dangerous history. Each cerebral hemisphere performs specific functions. In most people, the left hemisphere contains the general interpretive and speech centers. Reading, writing, and speaking are dependent on processing done in the left hemisphere as well. The left hemisphere is also important in performing analytical tasks such as mathematics. The right hemisphere analyzes sensory information and helps identify touch, smell, and sight. The right hemisphere is important in recognizing faces and understanding three-dimensional relationships. It is also important in analyzing emotional context of conversations. The area for hand movements is larger on the left premotor cortex for right-handed people.